A referendum in eastern Ukraine. The government in Kiev describes the vote as a step towards the abyss, while Moscow seems to be distancing itself from events on the ground. So how is this referendum different from an earlier vote in Crimea? What will it all mean for Ukraine's future? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Sami Zeidan. Voters in two regions in eastern Ukraine have been voting in a referendum on self-rule. Now, the Ukrainian government and Western nations are condemning the hastily organized vote. And even the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, has backtracked from his previously hardline rhetoric by urging pro-Russian separatists to delay the vote. Well, that didn't appear to have much effect, though, on Sunday, as people in Donetsk and Lugansk went to the polls. They were asked just one question on their ballot papers in both Ukrainian and Russian. Do you support the act of state self-rule of the Donetsk People's Republic or Lugansk People's Republic? Well, Paul Brennan has been looking at how that poll went.
The polling stations have now been open for several hours, and as you can see behind me, business has been brisk, regardless of what the international community describes it, illegal, a step towards the abyss. The people here in Donetsk and elsewhere in the eastern regions of Ukraine, they are keen to put their tick into a box. They're going into a voting booth in the corner there, putting their votes into these two perspex ballot boxes, and they will all be counted, we are told, later on tonight. So far, I've seen a grand total of 2 no votes. Everything else that we've seen has been a vote for yes. But it's important to just clarify this. Although the vote has been organized by effectively masked paramilitaries who have taken over government buildings across several towns here in the east of Ukraine, the people who are actually coming out here to vote are not doing it as a raging mob. They're not doing it at gunpoint. They're not being forced to be here. They have genuinely got grievances with the relationship that the east of Ukraine has with Kiev, and they want those grievances addressed. So for Kiev to dismiss these people as terrorists is simply not addressing the root of the problem. And that is something that I think Kiev is going to have to address, regardless of the legality or otherwise of the outcome of this ballot. Paul Brennan for Inside Story, Donetsk.
Now, Ukraine's acting president is warning of serious consequences if the referendum goes ahead. As we just heard there, Alexander Turchinov said secession from Ukraine would be a step into the abyss for these regions. Those who stand for self-rule do not understand it would mean complete destruction of the economy, social programs and life in general for the majority of the population. Well, those views aren't shared by everyone, particularly in eastern Ukraine.
I was born here. I love my country. I love my motherland. I just don't have the words to express what is happening in our country. I have come so that there will be stability, so that they will just leave us in peace and let us live peacefully.
I want peace in this country. I don't want this horrible mess from Kiev that created in the Maidan. A war, the killing of the people, and it continues here.
I don't think we should separate. We are one country. We've been together for more than 20 years.
Well, for more on this, let's bring our guests into the discussion now. From Kiev, Mychailo Wynnychyj, an associate professor at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. From London, Lilit Gevorgyan, Russia analyst at IHS Global think tank. And from Moscow, Alexander Shumilin, a political analyst and columnist for the Moscow Times. Good to have you with us. If we could start with Kiev. Mychailo, we've had the poll, despite objections from Kiev. What will the next step and reaction be from the Ukrainian capital? Will we see a large, full-scale assault on the areas in Lugansk and Donetsk?
Well, I think that the assault that exists, that is currently ongoing in the town of Slovyansk and the town of Mariupol will probably continue until such time as the criminal elements have been either arrested or eliminated.
But I mean, they have been sort of moving back and forwards, haven't they, on their military operation? There is a question about whether this will now be stepped up and ramped up.
I doubt it. I think it's a scenario of the important thing is that we have some values, and that is the value of human life. And when you've got people that are unarmed standing in the way of those that are armed, the Ukrainian side is yet again, rightly or wrongly, showing some restraint, as it did in Crimea and as it has again in the east of the country. I really don't think the referendum is going to, or the quote referendum is going to matter that much to the anti-terrorist operation.
All right, let's bring in Lilit into the discussion. What if the regions start forming their own institutions and armies, as seems to be the case so far from indications which are coming out so far?
Well, I think that would be the logic of the current decision that some of the eastern regions and southern regions of Ukraine have taken. They see themselves as embarking on a path of autonomy, something that would be similar to Crimea. And how would this wave into the general narrative that the Ukrainian central government is pushing, which is we have to finish this conflict and make sure that Ukraine is a one united country? It's a big question, and I think there is a big gap emerging despite all the efforts between Kyiv and the eastern regions, and it seems that Kyiv at the moment doesn't really have a clear strategy how to bring on board the eastern regions.
Alexander Shumilin, why is Russia not welcoming the vote that's happening in places like Lugansk and Donetsk in the same way that it did with Crimea?
You see, it's a rather complicated issue. The situation in the eastern part of Ukraine is rather different from the Crimea, and the main point is the interest of Moscow in those areas. Crimea was very interesting for Mr. Putin for one reason. For one main reason, it is the base for the fleet. It's a very important one.
So basically, because Russia doesn't have such a big base in Lugansk and Donetsk, it's not up on the priority list for Mr. Putin.
Yes, it's one of explanations. The other one is the pressure on the western side on Moscow to stop intervening into the Ukrainian affairs. It's not to underestimate. And the third reason, if you want, is that the majority of the local population in Lugansk, Donetsk, and eastern part of Ukraine as a whole is not against remaining within the Ukraine. It is against joining Russia. So the ongoing polls now in Donetsk and Lugansk are very doubtful. They are not to be recognized by any part. At the current time point, nobody knows what to do next.
Well, but comparisons, of course, have been made between this vote and the one that took place in Crimea in March. Well, following that vote, Russia, of course, annexed Crimea. It's not clear that Russia intends to do the same with Donetsk and Lugansk, though. The vote leaves open the possibility of more autonomy without secession, as we heard President Putin urging pro-Russia separatists to delay this vote, though he did give his full backing to Crimea's referendum. And this vote will be less representative than Crimea's. Only people in areas under separatist control can cast their ballots, and that represents less than half of the region's 7 million people. Let's go to Mychailo in Kyiv. You know, the narrative from Kyiv has been pretty consistent all along that what's going on in the east of Ukraine, in Donetsk and Lugansk, is just masked Russian interference. The Russians want to break this part of Ukraine away. Is that really the case? It seems at some points like Putin's urges and calls are being ignored by people there. How much really influence does Russia have there?
wonderful. It's a wonderful way of spinning Mr. Putin is wonderful at spinning the Western press in terms of making it believe that, yes, now you see I've asked people not to have this referendum and therefore they're not listening to me, so it's actually not me that's involved. Clearly, Mr. Putin's forces are directly involved on the ground. There's ample evidence of, first of all, military equipment being used that can only be available from Russia. Second, we have people that have been caught on the ground red-handed with Russian passports that are Russian military servicemen. So, I mean, to say that these people are not connected to Putin is, quite frankly, just as farcical as the referendum itself. Because, I mean, the difference between what we're finding out, actually, your point was very well made about the parallel between the referendum in Donetsk and Luhansk and what happened in Crimea a month and a half ago. As we found out just recently, even according to Russian sources, Kremlin official sources, less than 15%, 15% of Crimeans actually supported Crimean annexation to Russia. What we're seeing in Donetsk and Luhansk is, yesterday, for example, we had
how do we know those figures?
Hang
on,
that was arrested by some of the anti-terrorist forces.
For a source on that, how do we know that only 15% of people in Crimea actually supported
that was a report that was put up on the website of the responsible for human rights, that's his title, of the president of the Russian Federation. The report came up for about half an hour and then was immediately taken down. It was on the official website of the Kremlin, and it was, I mean, it's a report that's been very widely confirmed. The issue with the Donetsk and Luhansk referendum is this. I mean, yesterday we had a car that was arrested by anti-terrorist forces with 100,000, over 100,000 ballot papers in the car marked yes. Today we've got people that are, I mean, we've got ample reports of people going to multiple polling stations and saying, oh, yes, I'm a citizen of Donetsk. In fact, they come from Kyiv, they come from Russia, they come from Crimea, they come from a variety of different places. They pick up 2, 3, 4, 5 ballots at a time to vote for themselves, for their neighbors, for their daughters, for their sons, for their wives, etc. All of this is farcical. It's not a referendum by any means. And certainly you don't run a referendum on independence when you've got Kalashnikovs on the streets.
Let's take this point to Alexander. Regardless, I guess, in a sense of how free and fair and well-run and supervised the referendums were, at the end of the day, if you have self-appointed authorities in Lugansk and Donetsk who say, we've had a referendum, this has been the result, now we're asking Russia to recognize, to support, won't that put Moscow in a very awkward position to deny recognition of this referendum and basically ignore that it ever happened?
Yeah, it's also a very difficult issue for Kremlin to do. What to do? Because
so what do you think the Kremlin would do?
Is proclaimed.
Or perhaps, as people like Mychailo would say, this is all just a very carefully engineered spin, that the Kremlin is pretending not to want to do what it really wants to do.
Yes, that is the point. Exactly. Officially, Kremlin invited the initiators of the referendum to refrain and to delay it and to make some estimates of the situation and to prolong some negotiations. But the whole issue of the referendum is a very special one. You see, our colleague mentioned the Crimea referendum. I would not agree completely with him because it is not so much evidence that the majority of the Crimean people, I mean especially Ukrainian portion of the population there, as well as Tatars, they were for joining Russia. The referendum there was rigged and it is recognized and proved. The same thing is going on now in Lugansk and Donetsk. The issue is what is the scale of the falsifications, and it is very important what our colleague mentioned, the case when the anti-terrorist forces seized a scope of bulletins already fills for the independence of those areas.
So are you saying that, do you think,
Alexander,
sorry, but are you saying that you genuinely believe that the majority of people in the east of Ukraine, as well as in Crimea, they genuinely do not want to be either part of Russia or a greater degree of autonomy?
I would make difference between Crimea and eastern Ukraine. In Crimea, the most part of the Russian population, yes, I would like to underline it, the Russian population, which constituted at that moment over 60%, were for joining Russia. But the rest of the population, Ukrainian and Tatars and a part of Russians living there, were against it. It is proven, yes. But the most
So that'll probably be more than the 15% that's been bounced around the show then, if you talk about most of the 60%.
It is to be.
Sami, look,
proven,
wait a second.
Yes.
Let me jump in here. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Let me jump in here because look, you made a very good point about the fact that these are self-appointed governments. Okay. And the fact is that you've got people, I mean, this is what the sad thing is going on at the moment. It happened in Crimea, and it's happening again in Donetsk and Luhansk and in a lot of small cities in the eastern part of the country. People are afraid of exiting their houses. People don't go to work. People don't go to the store. Kids don't go to school because you've got people running around on the streets with rifles and automatic weapons and rocketry. In that kind of an environment, whether it's 15% or 50% or 40% or 30%, the numbers don't matter. The fact is it's rigged. It can't be done in a democratic kind of way.
Let me bring Lilit into the discussion. I hear and understand what Mychailo is saying.
Yes.
Just give Lilit a chance here. I understand what people like Mychailo are saying. The situation is not normal. It's not a normal situation to have any kind of democratic process. Well, I guess I still have a question, or a question is raised by people, some people in the East, shall we say. Why should Eastern Ukrainians abide by the rules, the normal democratic process, the constitution, when they say, in their opinion, Western Ukrainians ignored the rules, the constitution and everything else after the overthrow of former President Yanukovych?
Well, precisely, and this has been the Russian argument, and this has been the argument of those elements in the east and southern Ukraine. So in some ways, it's very interesting to listen to the other participants of this discussion as to find elements as to why the vote is rigged. The fact is that the West and Kyiv are not going to accept the results of the referendum, and from Russian perspective, they have distanced themselves from this referendum temporarily. I have to point out that when President Putin called for cancelling the referendum, he merely suggested delaying it. So what we're really seeing is a tool almost emerging out of this referendum for Kremlin and for those in eastern and southern Ukraine who would say, precisely as you put it, since you have done it in Kiev, we can do it also in eastern regions.
Lilit, if I ask you another question,
sure.
What exactly is the referendum on? Is it clear whether people are being asked to break away, to have a separate state, to have more autonomy, or to join Russia?
I think the main question is about independence, which some people have interpreted as autonomy. I think there is a confusion about this as well.
Is it deliberate confusion? Ambiguity?
I think that the question is clear.
There's no ambiguity. The question on the ballot is clear.
But
exactly.
Is it really, Mychailo, when you read the a statement like, do you support state self-rule for the People's Republic? Are we talking about a republic within Ukraine, an autonomous republic like you have in the Russian Federation? Are you talking about an independent state of a republic? I'm not so sure it is.
Come on. Oh, come on. Well, first of all, I mean, does it? I mean, the major question is, does it matter? When you've got a rigged referendum, what difference does it make what's on the ballot? But the fact is that the ballot question is actually, I mean, I have to give it to the terrorists in the East, and that is that they've made their question quite clear. Do you support the declaration of independence of the Donetsk People's Republic or the Luhansk People's Republic, depending on which particular territory you're talking about? Now, they've made it very clear that they plan to have another referendum immediately after that, that once they have declared independence, then they will have another referendum about joining Russia. Now, of course, that one's still up in the air, because first of all, you have to have an independence before you join another state, or at least that's the logic that they're working through.
Okay, Mychailo, answer this then for me. The Constitution said that the removal of the former removal of a president in Ukraine should be following a review by Ukraine's Constitutional Court, a 3/4 vote in Parliament. And according to the 96 Constitution, which was in effect, it should be the acting Prime Minister who takes over. Now, some Eastern Ukrainians say none of that was followed.
No.
Why should they be asked to play by the rules,
okay, wait a second,
which in their opinion, the Western Ukrainians aren't playing by?
Okay, first of all, it's not the Western Ukrainians. It's the Western and Central and Southern Ukrainians. It's 22 oblasts of the country versus 25. So in other words, three that disagree versus 22 that do.
As you said, the numbers don't count. So let's put that aside and move on.
Right. Okay. So the legitimately elected government, the legitimately elected parliament, parliament that was elected under Yanukovych, decided to appoint Yatsenyuk as prime minister. He is not acting prime minister. He is the constitutionally elected prime minister.
But without 338 votes, with only 328 votes, and without a review by the Constitutional Court.
You need 200. Sammy, you need 226 votes. You need 226 votes to elect a prime minister.
I think that depends on whether you're following the 96 or 2004 Constitution, which is part of the problem here.
No, sir.
Each side is citing
450 deputies in Parliament, 226 is a majority, 226 voted to oust the former Prime Minister and to elect a new Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is 100% legitimate. Where there is a question of legitimacy is with Turchynov, who is the acting president. And if you notice, all of the ministers always have minister so-and-so, except for the Minister of Defense and the acting Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. These three people are the ones that are questionably legitimate when it comes to legalities. That's the reason that we need to have a presidential election on May 25th, and why it's so important for Putin to make sure that that presidential election doesn't happen is because he wants to make sure that there is this question of legitimacy. After the May 25th election, there's only one. There are no people that are illegitimate or questionably legitimate within the Ukrainian government.
Okay, Lilit, once again, when you talk to people in different parts of the country, you get a very different narrative of the rules or even which constitution is in effect or should be in effect. That says something about the difficulty of coming to a common ground, doesn't it?
I think the part of the problem or the even tragedy of the current crisis has been the different narrative. And as I said earlier, the gap is growing, it's widening, and it is not in Ukraine's national interest. When the pro-European or Maidan demonstrators refer to Eastern Ukrainians as terrorists, and operations are launched which are codenamed as anti-terrorist operations, this is aggravating the situation. This is in some ways also dismissing valid. Can I just finish?
Let's just let Lily finish if we could, Mychailo.
Sure.
Whilst there are undeniably there are armed militia people who have been taking control of administrative buildings and arguing that they're mirroring the events in February and earlier that pro-European demonstrators have done.
Right.
At the same time, there are many in eastern and southern Ukraine, civilians, peaceful people who have legitimate concerns. It would be in Ukraine's interest as well if the current government also recognizes that some of these concerns haven't been acknowledged in the beginning.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave the discussion there. I'm sorry, gentlemen. This could go on for a very long time, but we are at the end of this show. Let's thank our guests, Mychailo Wynnychyj, Lilit Gevorgyan and Alexander Shumilin. And please add your voice to this discussion. Of course, you can leave your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or go to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Sami Zeidan. Thanks for watching. It's goodbye for now.